Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first of four events from the Minnesota Historical Society to discuss shared spaces and public places. We're going to be discussing case studies, both here in Minnesota and nationally, where places and spaces have been renamed or reclaimed. And we are gathering online right now in our homes and offices. I suspect most of us are joining us from the ancestral homelands of the Dakota and Anishinaabe people. In some cases during this series, we will be talking about renaming something, like the next conversation we're going to have next month, where there was a school in Minneapolis renamed after Justice Alan Page. But today, it's about reclaiming a name. And you're going to learn more about how Lake Calhoun in Minneapolis was reclaimed to its earlier name, Bde Maka Ska. One of the goals here of this series is to provide common language for people, especially those who are interested in these kinds of efforts. Maybe there's something in your community you'd like to rename or reclaim. And the truth is, you're not alone. It has been done. Then maybe you'll get some assists out of this for your efforts. My guests today include two sisters who were a big part of how Bde Maka Ska's name was restored in what was a 4 to 5 year process. Dr. Kate Beane is a historian and director of Native American initiatives at the Minnesota Historical Society, and Flandreau Santee Sioux Dakota tribal citizen. Kate, nice to see you. Thanks for being here. Carly Badhart-Bull is executive director of the Native Ways Federation, which works with nonprofits to better serve and create awareness of American Indian communities across the U.S., also a proud citizen of the Flandreau Santee tribe. Carly, welcome. Thank you for being here. And Tracy Nordstrom, a former Minneapolis Park Board member who served on the board's Citizen Advisory Committee with Carly and Kate, was part of this effort, also lives very close to Bde Maka Ska. Tracy, thank you for being here as well. Carly, I want to start with this kind of a thinker. What advice would you give several years ago, Carly, to better prepare Carly for the 5-year effort Carly was about to undergo?
Oh, that's such a good question. I would say it's worth it. Stick with it. It was hard. It was really hard. I'm not going to lie. It was not easy. And that's one of the things that we try to share with folks, especially as we talk about the importance not only of the issue at hand, but the process that we went through, and the fact that some of these processes need to be changed. The fact that we went through some processes that were so arduous, we had to jump through so many hurdles to get this name restoration to happen. And at the end of the day, when it shouldn't have we shouldn't have had to. And so what we're hoping is by sharing our story, by sharing what we went through, that other folks can help to change some of these processes, to be able to think ahead of these things so that we can make more of this stuff happen in the future. And that's what we're so excited about with even though it took over 5 years and went all the way through the Supreme Court, now we have a process to make sure that we can do more things like this. So I would have told myself, just stick with it. It's worth it. All those late nights, all those evenings with your babies up at the podium, it's going to be worth it. It's going to happen.
Kate, similar advice to several years ago, Kate?
Yeah, I think, it's so easy looking back now with rose-colored glasses, and when in reality, when we're in the thick of it, we're in the middle of it, like my sister said, we were oftentimes within these processes, they're not inclusive processes. We're notified literally 5 minutes before a meeting that something was going to happen. We showed up with our kids. We got dinner on the way. We ate the snacks at the meeting with our kids. And we showed up. And the main thing is showing up. The main thing is making the effort and trying. And like my sister said, when you are told no, when you are told that you are not welcome within a space or a process or a place, to remember that it's not just about you as an individual, that you're representing community and you're representing voices and peoples and families that have not had a seat at the table historically. And sometimes you have to bring your own chair, but you show up and you stay committed.
Tracy, your son's middle name is Calhoun. How did you come to this effort?
How did I come to this effort? Well, I was asked to serve on the Citizen Advisory Committee, which was looking at improvements to what was formerly called Lake Calhoun and Lake Harriet. And that's where I met Kate and Carly. They were citizen appointees as well. Not thinking that one of the improvements that we would make to the park would be to restore the name. And that became a topic of conversation the first evening, and I was compelled. I heard Carly talk about her family history and Kate. And when I got home and talked to my own family, I said, you know, this is pretty interesting because my oldest son's middle name is Calhoun, not named after John C. Calhoun, but named after the fact that I lived near a very special body of water. And I did not know the story of John Calhoun, and I did not know that there was an erased history at that place. So it became a topic of robust conversation with my son, who was, I have to do the math, might have been about 15 at the time, and thinking through what that would mean. If the lake received a restored name, would my son need a new middle name? And it made for a very interesting conversation with my other kids who are younger and my husband. And so Kate and Carly brought us together over a difficult conversation at our dinner table.
And I'm going to come to the history in one moment, Kate, but Carly, I am thinking about this process, and you mentioned that there's a governmental process. A lot of times to change names, you have to go through some kind of board or several boards, and I want to get into that in a moment. But I'm also thinking about, what's your process? If we have people listening who are from communities where they want to see something changed, what is the thing they should be doing? And I'm asking that because I see a lot of call outs on social media that this should change. And and sometimes that works, frankly. Sometimes you get a tweet storm going and the thing gets changed the next week. And I wonder if that's really the way to do it. Is the tweet storm the first step or the ninth step? What would you say to people who are thinking about efforts like this?
I'm terrible with Twitter, so I have no idea. I can't help with that part. What I can say is that for us, what mattered was community engagement. Was huge. And so, you know, reaching out to the Native community and the non-Native community. That's what was so huge, you know, and important about this in particular, and continues to be, is that this was an issue that brought people together. As much as folks who were against it tried to say it was a divisive issue, it wasn't. You know, what this was, when we look at the actual process and the folks who showed up at the public hearings that were laid out, you know, who showed up and said their piece, these were folks from, you know, multiple immigrant communities, you know, Native, non-Native communities, white communities, who all showed up and said, this is why this is important to me. This is why this is an important issue for me in this place that I call home. And this is what helps me feel more connected to this place and to this lake that we collectively love. And so that's where, you know, this community engagement piece. But what we had to do is we had to get out and we had to start talking to people. And so on this CAC, what we did is we created an equity subcommittee, which had never been done before. And we went out and we talked to folks and we told them this, you know, we told them our story, our family story, the Dakota story, story of who John C. Calhoun was. And then we asked them, like, what would make you feel more welcome here? And we asked folks from communities who maybe typically you weren't seen at the lakes, because the lakes tend to be a more affluent kind of community population. And what we heard, what we found out, like overwhelmingly, we actually, it's in the master report for the park board plan. The number one equity recommendation that was brought to the table was to change the name and to restore it to the Dakota name.
So that, Kate, that sounds like education is step one in many of these instances, where you just have to tell that story.
Yeah, you know, my sister and I, we are the daughters of a community organizer, and neither one of us graduated from high school. Yet we went on to become successful. My sister received her law degree. I went on to earn a doctorate and serve as director of Native American initiatives here at the Minnesota Historical Society, and also teach. but this work that we took part in was work that was very personal to us. It was separate from our everyday jobs. This was work that we did in the evening in order to educate our communities, to help educate. And part of that is because growing up, we didn't know these stories either. We didn't know all of this history because of what happened to us over time in history as Dakota people who were removed from the state. You know, our relatives are on our reservation in Flandreau, South Dakota, but we are originally from here. We are from Bde Maka Ska. We are from Black Dogs Village. We are the granddaughters of Muskogee, who was a leader at Bde Maka Ska. And as we were growing up, we heard some of the stories about our families from our grandparents and from our relatives, and we heard that oral history. And then as we became older, we were, you know, like I said, we were the daughter of a community organizer. We were very well read, very self-educated. And at a certain point, when we moved back to Minnesota, we decided that education was important, that we needed to take charge of our education, that it was up to us, you know, to take that journey. And to have the education that we deserved, we have to be in charge of it. And, you know, and thinking about what sort of led us to drop out of school when we were young, it was not seeing ourselves represented in the curriculum. It was always learning about other people. It was learning that we came from a defeated nation, that we had been conquered. All of those narratives are not true. We come from thriving, beautiful communities who are very resilient. There is so much positivity within our communities, and there are reasons for some of the struggles that are within our communities, and we know where those things come from. And it's up to our communities to be able to step up and showcase the fact that we as sovereign nations can lead the way in restoring and repairing our communities. And in order to do that, we have to have education. In order to do that, our kids need to know where they come from. Our kids need to know our stories. Our kids need to feel welcome at these places of historic significance for us. And at Bde Maka Ska, the historic significance of this place is there's just so many stories to it. You know, there was 10 years where our community, had a village site there in the 1830s, which was one of the first Western-style farming communities in Dakota. For Dakota people, and other Dakota communities had farmed. Little Crow had farmed. Other leaders had farmed with different villages. But this is the first one that lasted over 10 years for a longer period of time. And it happened because at that period of time, there was a lot of starvation that was going on because of the expansion of the fur trade industry, which was exploiting our resources and our foods. And our children were starving, our people were starving. And our grandfather, Muskogee, agreed. There's a story that he actually got lost in a blizzard, searching out on a hunt with some other men, some warriors. They were out on a hunt, and they got lost in a blizzard because they had to go further than they normally would because there was no game. And they buried themselves under the snow. And while he was buried under the snow for 3 days and 2 nights, what he did is he promised to Tunkashida, to the Great Spirit, to God, that if he survived, he promised that he would help lead his community another way, to try another way. And so it wasn't that they gave up being Dakota in any way. Our people had always harvested, had always gardened. But what they did is they incorporated the Western plow, and they also stayed in one spot for a period of 10 years. And that's also where early missionaries first came in and started documenting the language. So part of the history here is that you have the first documentation of Dakota language, the first dictionaries that were written in our language, which we still use today to revitalize our languages. And then you also had this history where Dakota people were farming and growing foods at a place that had historically nourished us with wild artichokes, wild strawberries. There used to be full of wild rice there. It was traditionally a place we fished and harvested wild rice. And this was a place that then we were able to grow other kinds of food. Not only did our families not starve, the surrounding families didn't starve, and we shared in the harvest with the surrounding communities. So there's a history of generosity here, and there's a history for our language.
And can I add one thing? So to many average Americans, we're primarily a people of the past. And so that's a part of the importance of this education. 87% of state history standards across the country only include Native people in a pre-1900 context. Like we were once here,
yeah.
We were once here and then we disappeared. And this is what our kids are hearing. And so that's what, my son, I chose to give birth to him at a birth center overlooking Bde Maka Ska, in part because I wanted him to have it ingrained in him from birth, to know where he came from and to be proud of that. And to not have this dominant narrative that, you were a people that were conquered and are now defeated, be part of your story. And that's something that, we want to share with other Native kids. And what we saw when we did this, there was a ceremony in January of, I think it was that 2018, where when the name restoration officially happened, the signs were changed before the Supreme Court case and everything. But who showed up? They were Native youth from schools like Center School and other schools where, these are the alternative schools where, kids who supposedly aren't making it through regular public schools. They showed up, they smudged us down. They were so proud, so excited. This was like 8, 9 in the morning. It was like ridiculously cold. These are not, raining? It was the temperatures were ridiculous. But these are kids who, they were so proud to have this opportunity to showcase who they were and who they're, for themselves, but also for other people. To not just be acknowledged, but to be celebrated. And that's what's really important.
So as we think of the process to go through, as you describe these beautiful moments, but it wasn't just a matter of getting one city council to approve a name change. In fact, just kind of, what is the list? Like there's a park board in Minneapolis, the Minneapolis Park Board. What's the list?
There's many layers to it. And I think you're right. The stories were really important. And the investigative work that has to happen at the beginning is to know who has the regulatory power to do this work. And Bde Maka Ska has many layers of ownership or stewardship of the lake. And we started with the Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board, and the park board asked us as citizens to come forward. And so Kate and Carly and I were part of a group of citizens. We met for 2 years, almost 2 years. And as Kate and Carly have both pointed out, we worked among community members to build some support. But the next level was Hennepin County, because the chain of lakes in Minneapolis is part of the regional park system. So the first vote was in our citizen group of our equity subcommittee. Then it was of the entire citizen group. Then we went to the Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board, and we got a unanimous vote. Then we went to Hennepin County, and it was another whole round of testimony and planning and who are our speakers going to be and who would be in the audience. The audience in all of these meetings to date overflowing with Indigenous folk, with children, with elders, with African Americans, with new immigrants to the Twin Cities. And a few of us white folks showed up too, with signs and cheer and goodwill. And beyond that, the next stage was with the state of Minnesota. And we have this unusual governance in that natural resources, including bodies of water, are named by the Department of Natural Resources. One particular person, the state climatologist, odd, significant name, the state climatologist, is who we had to work with and convince and persuade and shape and mold and tell those stories to. And then who was next? So then it went to the federal government after the DNR approved it, right? Then it went to the Department of the Interior with the federal government. And while that was happening, there was a lawsuit in Minnesota, right? Carly, am I remembering that right?
Yep, Save Lake Calhoun.
Against the park board for changing the name, and that went all the way to the Minnesota Supreme Court.
Well,
and that
Go
So
ahead.
that was against the state.
Yeah.
Against the
But
state
it's-
DNR. Yep.
So there are people who might have an effort in their community where it won't be this arduous.
Let's
It
hope
may
not.
it may just be, for example, and I think the school board has to rename a school building, so it's only one entity. But the key here, and we were talking before this as we were doing our preparation for this, the key here is, the lesson is, you have to have done all of this homework
Mhm.
really before you put yourself out there. Is that a fair way to say that, Carly, or no?
Yeah, I would say so. It was. I shared this in one of our earlier conversations. We were in a meeting with Hennepin County commissioners, and at one point they were asking us question after question about, what if we get asked this about the spelling of the name? What if we get asked this about, there were multiple names, and we had answers for everything. We had done our homework. And at one point, one of the Hennepin County commissioners looked at me and said, you should go to law school. And I was like, well, I did. I went to the University of Minnesota Law School.
I already have a law.
I already have a law degree. But and that's one of the things also that I just want to add, that I'm not trying to disparage anyone, but the fact that there were a couple of Native women involved with this process, we knew what we were doing. Well, I don't know. Sometimes we weren't sure that we did, but at the same time, we knew that we had the ability to do what needed to get done. We knew what the right thing was, and we had a vision. And we're twins, and so there's that thing too, is that like we work really well together because of that. But there were a lot of times where we faced folks who were not prepared for us, I guess. We faced folks who said, you know what? Oh, this is really interesting. We should get a historian. Well, Dr. Kate Beane is right here. Or let's talk to an attorney about, well, Carly. But it's not saying that like we knew everything that needed to happen, because we definitely engaged with other folks and that needed to happen. But I just want to add that, like, for especially for Native communities that are trying to do this and who feel like they're being told, no, you don't have the authority, you don't have the credentials, you don't have the whatever it is, let's talk. And you do. We know you do, because we know as Native people that we have connections to our history, understandings of policy, of navigating systems, because we've had to as Native people. And a lot of people don't understand that Native people have to have a good understanding of how to navigate political processes for a number of reasons. And so just helping folks understand that, then that you can do it, no matter what people tell you, even if. Yeah.
And Kate, that sounds like microaggressions, really, maybe even macroaggressions in some cases along the way. How do you walk through that? I suppose as a Native woman, you have to walk through it every day, but like, was it particularly acute in these processes?
It was particularly acute, and particularly for me working at a public institution, and the variety of ways in which I engage with this topic and these issues, both personally as somebody who was advocating for the name restoration, but then also as a professional within the Minnesota Historical Society, who, some of these topics came across my desk, and providing resources and historic archives to help others to contextualize and understand this place. And so, that I would definitely call them macroaggressions. I would definitely say that there were issues of white supremacy here that really led the conversation in a lot of ways. There was a lot of backlash. Our family received hate mail. I received hate mail at work. Our father received hate mail at home. And we saw that backlash come up with the signage when they were vandalized numerous times. We saw it in the comment section of the local papers, where we didn't give rebuttals. We knew our responses. We knew that both the and the B in our language, that we have different dialects in our language, and that they mean the same thing, and that it's a soft B, and that we know the history of where we come from, and we know that oral history, which it runs deeper and is still carried forth in our communities in a real living way than was documented by early missionaries. We know that we continue as a people, and we know our stories, we know who we are. We're the ones who can help share that information. We're the ones who know our languages and who know our stories. And what we saw was white supremacy rearing its ugly head, with people who discredited us because of who we are as Dakota women, and people who literally, reporters even calling our father up on the phone and asking, why, what are the credentials of your daughters for doing this work? He's like, well, one's a doctor, one's a lawyer. We were second guessed. Instead of being a historian, I was labeled an activist. Not that there's anything wrong with being an activist, but I am a professional historian. And I also was very careful about making sure that this work that I did was very separate from the work that I did at the Minnesota Historical Society. This event right now is the first time that these worlds have collided for me. And I'm proud that I work at an institution that isn't afraid to see that happen. But it's been a journey, and I think we've all been learning as we go. And have been trying to be very cautious and try to protect our communities and our stories and each other, so that we can get the story right.
I think we have a couple photos, in fact, maybe one of the graffiti, but also some of the photos from some of these gatherings. So I don't know if we've already put those up, but that may be coming up here on the screen too. One group, I'm just going to point out one more example. One group that was opposed wrote an op-ed in the paper, and there you can see Kate and Carly there in that photo. This op-ed in the paper used this line: "What exactly have the Dakota Indians done that is a positive contribution to all Minnesotans?" Which is interesting to me because he used the word Minnesota in a sentence where he was asking about the contributions of the Dakota people. So I'm guessing he didn't realize that Minnesota was a Dakota word. And I don't know if that was ever pointed out to him. But Tracy, what were the pushbacks you heard? I think you live closest to the lake of anyone on this panel. What did you hear? I mean, I understand you also heard a lot of positive. Like, I just want to spend.
I heard the negative too.
But you heard the negative. Well, what were the kind of comment? What should people expect when they go into this process?
Yeah, I think the most predominant narrative I heard was, why do you want to erase history? Right? I think one of the most, and I'll talk about that in a second, but one of the most ludicrous things I heard at the park board meeting was a white woman got up and said, Lake Calhoun is a brand, and we can't lose that brand. That's important for our city's identity, the brand of Calhoun. And it was interesting. Some of my neighbors said, if you remove the name Calhoun, does that mean we need to remove the name Jefferson and Washington? They were slaveholders. And my response immediately, without thinking too much, was, well, we need to have a conversation about it. And maybe we do need to remove those names. And there was a real worry that because I was interested in adding this history to Bde Maka Ska, that I was trying to eliminate or erase white history. And I think, Carly, I've heard you the most say that this is an additive process rather than a reductive process. And that's ultimately what I would come back to and say, in my own experience, I feel like my own kids got gypped because they did not learn the rich history of this place. And they have this false sense that the Dakota people aren't here anymore. And look at two of the brightest stars of the Dakota world are right here on this call with us. And they have beautiful children and their star radiates. So I maybe wasn't very sympathetic to the folks that pushed back with me. And I pushed a little harder to say, you need to open your hearts and your minds a little bit. This is an opportunity for growth for this community and evolution.
To jump off on that, Carly, I mean, again, I'm thinking about this in the lens of people who might watch this later because they're going through their own effort. And it just does seem to me like no matter when or where this happens, one of the things they'll hear is, this is just a name. Why are you spending all of this time? There are so many other problems in the world. Why are you giving up your evenings. Well, it's just a name.
And we heard that a lot. And one of our responses was, well, if it's not such a big deal, why are you so scared? Why are you making it so hard? If we're telling you it's important to us, why are you so scared? And, this is, Dakota history is Minnesota history. Our stories need to be told and learned from by everyone. And why is that something that is hard for you? We're not changing history. And there's a saying, and we've said this and other folks have said this, but when you're accustomed to privilege, equality can feel like oppression. So a lot of the folks who felt like, who were opposed to this effort, they were fearful of our perspective. They were fearful of us being at the table saying this is important. And instead of just saying, okay, and stopping and listening. And saying, okay, let's just stop and listen, and hear why this is important, hear your stories. Because a huge part of what made, I think, this process successful was the fact that we did have the opportunity, or we in some places forced the opportunity, but to have truth storytelling and truth telling and sit face to face. I mean, we went to neighborhood groups where we knew that folks, when we walked into the room, were opposed to us. And when we walked out, we had seen some hearts and shifts of hearts and minds, because folks didn't realize that the connection that we had to this lake and to the name, and what it mattered to us and for our children and for future generations, not only for our kids, but for Native kids and for non-Native kids, for everyone, and that this was a broader kind of issue. That's what this was all about. And it took a while to get there, but that's what we were trying to do.
What about the fact that graduation rates for Native students in Minneapolis are a place where there's more gaps, right? Opportunity and achievement gaps. Does that have anything to do with this story?
Oh, it absolutely does. So I've done a lot of work in Native education across the region. And one of the things that I've heard, not only from Native education experts, but from Native kids, and as my sister shared, we didn't graduate from high school. So from our own personal experience as well, one of the biggest issues was this feeling of invisibility, this feeling of we don't matter. They don't see us. And why should we care? And so this invisibility issue, this issue of making sure that Native kids know that they matter, and also see themselves in our city. Again, not just being, for one, step one is being acknowledged, because that was, we're not acknowledged. You don't even see us in a lot of places, or if you do, you don't even know it's us. So many words in Minnesota, like the word Minnesota, are Dakota words, and people don't know this. They need to know this. And these are things that need to be celebrated. But also, other stories and other ways that our Native kids can know that we made contributions to this place, so that when they're walking around, downtown, for example, like downtown Minneapolis, and go, maybe go over to Nicollet Island. Over in Nicollet Island, that's where at one time we used to harvest maple sugar over in the maple, there are so many amazing stories that our people have, that our kids would benefit from, and would help them feel more connected to themselves and to this land. And that's one of my biggest things is, and it's not just mine. I think it's a lot of folks on this call too, but is we have so many issues in this country. So this is a national issue. This is not just a local Minneapolis issue. We have so many issues in this country that are related to divisiveness and disconnect. And what this is about is people are disconnected from one another, and they're disconnected from the land. And this is a big problem. And so what do we need to do about that? And this one example of Bde Maka Ska is just one small example, but it's something that we're trying to share with others around storytelling and connecting, to help folks understand how we can connect to each other and how we can help each other connect to the land, to get away from some of these bigger issues.
Kate, I'm going to take one more question. We are going to take some audience questions here in a moment, but Kate, next month when we have the next conversation, we're going to be talking about a school in Minneapolis that was renamed. It was Ramsey School. It became Justice Page School. And maybe I'm not looking in the right places, but I don't see a lot of continued feelings like it'll always be Ramsey School for me. But I have seen still some. It's always going to be Lake Calhoun for me. Why do you think that some of these renaming and reclaiming efforts carry more hurt feelings, I guess, or carry a kind of that tail for longer? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it has to do with people have their own connections. They have this nostalgia. They have this personal connection to these spaces that, in no way people want to interrupt or disconnect them from these spaces. If anything, we want to add to it and help people to see that these spaces have these different connections for other people too. Ramsey School, they still kept the name Ramsey on the building. Calhoun, more people know who John C. Calhoun was today than they did 5 years ago. In fact, it has done nothing but bring out education. And I know from my work, it's helped people to understand more of where some of the information about some of these individuals sits. And John C. Calhoun in particular never set foot in the state of Minnesota, as far as we know. And it's interesting to think about these things. And it's interesting to think about our connections to these spaces. And I think that, the previous question, if I could really quickly, I think that it's really interesting to think about, why would we take this up as hard as it was, the time it took away from our children and our families as full-time working moms? Why would we do this if it wasn't important? And I remember sitting in my car crying one night, just tired, exhausted, pregnant at a meeting, because I was like, would my grandfather Makbiyowichasha, who is the leader of our village there, would he really care about a name? And I remember thinking about it and coming to the realization that it wasn't about him, it wasn't about us, it was about our children. And it was about them feeling seen and heard at the places where they belong. And it was about our language being recognized and respected. And when my 3-year-old daughter, my daughter was 3 at the time, and the criticism at the park board was that it was Bde Maka Ska was too hard to say, my 3-year-old taught the park board how to say Bde Maka Ska. And that moment for her is something that she takes with her. And she's a little educator. And she is so proud of the ways that she contributed to this. She calls it her lake. She belongs there. That's where she wants to go. That's her at the public art. That's where she wants to be. That's where my little one learned to walk. That's where my nephew was born. And for them to know that they belong there and that their language belongs there and that they deserve to speak their language and that they have that right is incredibly important.
Before we take questions, I just want to see, what's the starkest memory? And maybe Kate, that was it for you, but what's maybe the small moment, the little moment, or the big moment? Tracy, I'll start with you, that just all these years later is just so vivid in your brain.
Well, clearly, when Kate's daughter, as a wee little one, taught us to say in the microphone, Bde Maka Ska, and we all said what she said, and she was teaching us all. And I just thought, there it is. The little ones will teach those of us who are hard and set in our ways. But I would say one of the memories that sticks with me through that experience was sort of the rainbow that we had of supporters, men and women, gay and straight, white and Black and Indigenous and new immigrants, and like me, an older immigrant, 3rd and 4th generation Minneapolis resident, all coming together to celebrate a hard win and an important win. And the friendships that developed. It was a real opportunity for us to learn about each other in this group as well. And then bring that back to whatever nuclear community we might be in to say, this important thing is happening at this place that we recognize that is important. Join us. That's how I felt.
Carly, what's the one memory that just is right there all the time?
Well, I think about folks like, there are folks who are in other parts of the country who are trying to do this, especially young folks. And one thing that I remember when we were in the midst of it is being like, again, is this worth it? And my sister and I having this conversation about, what, we don't know if this is going to happen, because the very first meetings we went to, I mean, Tracy was great. She was really like supportive at our table, but other than that, people thought we were crazy. Like, we did not have a lot of support at the beginning. And then at the end, of course, we ended up with the park board having unanimous support, but it took some time, took years. But the fact that we didn't know this was going to happen at any point along the way, I think when we went in there, we actually thought this was a long shot in some ways, but it was worth trying. And we kept going because we saw the momentum and the opportunity. But at the same time, all along the way, what we kept reminding ourselves is no matter what happens, people are talking. People are talking about Bde Maka Ska. People are talking about John C. Calhoun. People are talking about Dakota history. People are talking about these things. And that wasn't it. And it was in the news, where folks were saying these words and using the language. And, that was huge for us as people who come from this background of feeling invisible, just feeling like, what, we don't know what's going to happen at the end of the day, but whatever does happen, we know we did something, and that this is progress. And so that's what sticks with me.
Well, we're going to see if we have any questions from people leaving comments on our streams, and it'll pop up here at the bottom of the screen. We might not have any, which is fine because I have more, but I just wanted to see and give it a moment here. Kids are not often considered stakeholders in advocacy work, and you both mentioned bringing your kids to meetings. Can you tell us if and in what ways those experiences influenced your children in these important conversations? What are your thoughts in including younger generations in tough conversations and in history? Kate, I'll go back to you. You were speaking about that a moment ago. What would you expand to Megan's question here?
I think what's so important in teaching tough kids about, or in teaching, well, they are tough kids.
Well, they are tough kids.
About tough histories, is also remembering to teach them about their resilience and the power that they have, and to remind them of the strength of where they come from, and to not sugarcoat it. I can't say enough after the murder of George Floyd, and I live in a neighborhood that was literally destroyed, seeing the way my children took in the world around us at that time, what I learned about not sugarcoating for them, speaking the truth to them. Their perspective carries so much, even as young kids. Us as Native people, we can't hide the history of what happened to us from our kids. They live it. They are the embodiment of it. They are, they, as one person at one point said, the unfinished business of colonization. We were not meant to survive. Those early missionaries at Bde Maka Ska documented our language because they did not think that we would survive. And with my kids, what I see, when the lawsuit came up towards the end, when we had changed the name, and then there was a lawsuit that went to the Minnesota Supreme Court, and we found out about it when it hit the newspaper, just like everyone else. My daughter, who had been 3, was then, I think, 5 when that happened. And I told her about it. And I said somebody was fighting to remove the name Bde Maka Ska. And she started crying. And she said, "Mom, does that mean they're going to forget about us again?" And I was heartbroken. And I was so distraught. And then talking with my sister and my father, I realized that wasn't my answer for her, is that nobody can change it for us. Our language is always going to be here. Our names are always going to be here, whether some government officially recognizes it or not. Our hope is that we are officially recognized. Our hope is that we are included, and our children need to see that happen. But to teach my daughter that regardless of what someone says, she's going to be Dakota, and she's going to learn her language, and that's something nobody can take away from you in any court, was incredibly important.
Seems also like if you bring your kids to a public comment at a meeting, it can be a good moment too. So that might be something worth thinking about.
Yep. And just to add, like the fact that one of the arguments that was made by the Save Lake Calhoun folks was that the process that we used, bullied them or steamrolled them or whatever. They were arguing about the process. The process that we used was democracy in action. The process that we used was supporting, use your voice and it can make a difference. And so that's something I think that our kids need to hear too, is that use your voice and learn how and engage and to show up. And it can matter. And we've had so many issues with, the fact that our people we have not had seats at different tables that mattered. Our voices have not been listened to. But when we show up and when we show up together, Native, non-Native, multiple communities, we can make really important things and good things happen.
I want to see if there's another question here. Here's from Joan. It feels as if renaming streets has some precedence that can be pointed to Kirby Puckett Way. And I'm curious if there's ever been conversation about reclaiming streets and avenues that predate the city as Dakota foot trails. I work on Hennepin Avenue, which is currently being reconstructed, and I've wondered if this could be an opportunity. I'll throw that to the group if anyone has pondered that, and or if those foot trails had names, which I presume they did back in the days when it was only Dakota people here. Any thoughts, anybody?
One thing that I would mention is that I think sometimes what we've seen is that people will think that there's one name for something. And the fact is there are numerous bands of Dakota people. Our language is very visual. It's very descriptive, which is why it's so educational, and it shows us the world through the eyes of our ancestors years ago. And it's so beautiful and it teaches us. But I think it's important to understand that different bands have different names for different spaces, and that there's nothing wrong with that. And as we move forward, we see, Bde Maka Ska Parkway, where Tracy lives. We see the name changes of streets, Hennepin. The history of these individuals needs to be told in a way that's inclusive. There is a process for changing street names. Those processes within different places are different. I think when it comes to those historic foot trails, that's obviously a possibility. You need to do the community engagement. You need to talk to the community, and you need to have the right people at the table to engage around these decisions. We need to have a broad, diverse group of people as decision makers.
Raise your hand on this screen if you remember the first time you looked down at your phone on the map app and saw that the change was made, that it was now Bde Maka Ska.
It was immediate almost on Google Maps. Remember? I remember going, oh, it's there already.
It's there.
I don't know who made that decision.
I got text messages, screenshots sent.
It was incredible. I would, Tom, if I could add one thing on the community part, because I agree with Kate that when something is up for a name, you should bring as many people to the table as possible. And I think the thing that was the most powerful about this experience with these two women and the many others that were with us was that I do not look at the naming of anything in the same way anymore. And an example is in the Twin Cities, we have, for example, some new public spaces that are coming online in both Minneapolis and St. Paul. And I think while we can do some restoration of existing places, there are a lot of new places that are coming online. And I would just challenge anybody who's in our audience today, whatever community you are part of, whether you are an official decision maker or you are an influencer in your community, show up. I do think that's a superhero, showing up, and posit your suggestion, and then get the ball rolling, and then make friends and bring those friends with you and tell your story and let others tell their story. And pretty soon you might have a very compelling reason, and then do some homework and find some words in Dakota or in Ojibwe or whatever it is that you are trying to honor in that name. Bring it forward and get the conversation going.
And I just want to give a quick shout out to Perennial Cycle, if I can, because when we were in the process of the name restoration, You know, so many small businesses with the name Calhoun had not been changed yet. And we saw there was an influx of some of those name changes after the murder of George Floyd. But during the process, Perennial Cycle, which was formerly known as Calhoun Cycle, was the one small business that not only changed their name to Perennial, but had a whole process with it and came and advocated on our behalf. And so we always like to give them a shout out.
And they had started that before, I think, before we even had started all of this.
I know we have a few more questions. I probably won't get to all of them, but here's another one. Are there name reclamation processes happening now for other sites in the Twin Cities or other parts of Minnesota? Again, I'll throw that out to anyone who knows. You know, I don't know. I assume the answer is yes, because I see some nodding, but give us a few examples.
Yes. And I one thing that I just want to say that's interesting is one of the criticisms that we got with Bde Maka Ska was, well, if we do this, then it's going to be a domino effect. What's going to happen? And we were just like, yeah, like that's actually kind of a good thing. Why is that a bad thing? And so, you know, not like we're trying to change the name of everything, but like Tracy mentioned earlier, we got to have these conversations. This is important. And so there are numerous conversations that are happening around schools, around streets, around neighborhood groups. I don't know if other folks have other examples, but we're getting lots of messages from folks.
Are there any specifics, or is there sometimes a moment where it's a little too early where you don't want to say it out loud quite yet? I mean, and just fess up if that's the case. I don't know how this works. Maybe it sounds like that might be the case, Kate. Like there's a couple things percolating, but it's not really ready for prime time. Is that right?
Yeah, there are a couple of things happening that haven't really been made public yet, and people are laying the groundwork with certain spaces. And then there's other spaces like Fort Snelling where there was a whole public input process, which is great. And it's always interesting because people think that I started that because I work at the Minnesota Historical Study, and I didn't, which is interesting. But I was involved, you know, in that public input process. And it was really interesting to hear the different perspectives, you know, and at that space, which is historic Fort Snelling as a larger site, and then the state park down below at Bdote. And the backlash that came with adding the word Bdote on a sign, and the ways that we saw that backlash had to do with our language and who we are as Dakota people was really, really hard to see. But luckily, we have, you know, we get contacted all the time about different name changes of rivers, lakes, schools happening throughout the state. And in other places in North Dakota, there's a great group led by a young woman that's trying to rename Custer Park. And so all of these efforts, you know, we communicate and we support one another, and we learn from one another. And it's not to say that all of the name efforts are successful or even should be successful, but we have to be able to have conversations about them, and we have to be able to be at the table.
And I just want to add to like the question, the issue around that these names are too hard to say. So we keep hearing that. You know, we have heard it with Bde Maka Ska. We continue to hear it with neighborhood groups. We continue to hear it with other name restoration efforts, both in Dakota and Ojibwe. And when we were doing this effort, you know, Louise Erdrich wrote this beautiful letter that we were able to share with folks around, you know, you say Dakota and Ojibwe words all the time, and they roll off the tongue, and you don't even realize it. The word, again, the word Minnesota, like, okay, it's anglicized, but still, you know, folks don't even realize they're saying it. And you got to look at this history, this piece about, you know, who are you trying to make it easier for? You know, the fact is we are a community of Native people and immigrants, and like we're a lot of different people. We have a lot of different stories. And who are you trying to make the language sound, you know, roll off the tongue better for, sound easier for? Really, this is about our collective story and how we come together and have a better understanding of each other and learn how to speak each other's languages so that we can move forward together.
By the way, Fort Snelling is not the original name of Fort Snelling. So in whatever conversations are happening there. You can't use that as a reason to keep it because it's not the original name. But anyway, I digress. I'm just throwing that out there for any. It was Fort St. Anthony, right? Yeah. Any other questions here? I know we have a few. We probably won't get to them all, but I just want to see, can you talk about what, if any, Dakota history is formally taught in Minnesota schools? I believe there is a requirement that there is some Indigenous history taught, but I think Kate, and Carly, you would know, you would know more about that.
There are definitely recommendations within the standards. I think part of the issue is sometimes in creating curriculum, some teachers don't feel comfortable teaching it. And so there needs to be teacher education. And there needs to be the understanding that within who we are as Native people, that Dakota content, Dakota people can be incorporated in any topic. It doesn't just have to be, history in the 6th grade around the Dakota War. That's not who we are, and that's not our full story. We don't want to be, defined by one violent moment in history. There's more to our people than that. Yes, there was a big impact and continues to be a big impact, but there's a lot to us that as Native people that should be shared. And I know that recently there were social studies curriculum standards up for review, and there's always conversation about incorporating more Native content into curriculum for schools. And personally, I think it should be a requirement that people learn about the Indigenous people of the lands on which they live.
I would start with Marlena Miles' Dakota sitemap. And as a young graphic artist living in St. Paul and working here, she would tell you that one of the things you learn from the Dakota people is that they were always innovating and always changing. And that's what Kate taught us about the settlement to the side on Bde Maka Ska, right? Is that the people are always adapting and changing. And that is the story of Minnesota. My ancestors came as immigrants without knowing the English language. My ancestors happened to look like the people who were in charge. They adapted. They kept their culture. They adapted. And that is our story in Minnesota, is being adaptive, being humane, being creative, and supporting one another. And that's all of our cultures. So let's celebrate that.
This is also a really good book by Paul Durand with a beautiful map. Some of it came from the old Joseph Nicolay map. And I know Marlena knows this map as well, but Where the Waters Gather and Rivers Meet, there's a beautiful map in there that shows a lot of the place names, the Ojibwe and Dakota place names throughout the state. And some of that was documented from the Nicollet map, and some of that was documented in oral history interviews.
Yep. I just want to add 2 things. One, the importance of, again, Indian education for all. It's an effort I know that multiple folks are working on across the country, and there are folks in here in Minnesota working on it, and we need to emphasize that that understanding Native history is understanding Minnesota history, that our kids need to know it, and non-Native kids need to know it too. So this is a huge, huge thing. And the other one is, at the same time, we also have some very specific cultural education things that are happening in Indian country. For example, language immersion schools, and the importance of supporting those efforts too, because they might be trying to do things that are a little different and maybe don't meet standards in certain ways. But that, the folks who are running those programs are doing it because they really want our kids to know who they are as Dakota, as Anishinaabe people, and they want to be able to educate them in the language. And so this is another effort, another model that's happening, but that's just important to know about.
Well, for those watching, thank you for being here this hour. Please share this. This will exist after this live broadcast here on Facebook and YouTube, and the Historical Society will put it out on social media. So if you enjoyed this, share it. And frankly, if you know people who are undergoing these efforts, share it with them. We're hoping that it can help anyone who's part of those efforts. My thanks to Dr. Kate Beane and Carly Bad-Hartbull and Tracy Nordstrom for a great conversation. Be sure to join us next month. We'll have another one of these conversations. We'll be talking about that effort that I spoke about at one point during this hour, renaming a school in Minneapolis from Ramsey Middle School to Justice Allen Page Middle School. So that'll be the conversation next month. And thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Tom. Pidamaya.
Pidamaya.